Wonderful, that is you. I'll be downstairs monitoring this, but Anna knows how to get hold of me, so if there's anything. But you've tested it, everything seems fine.
Yeah,
so
it should be fine.
You'll be grand.
Thanks for setting up that auto thing as well.
Absolutely not. That's what I'm here to do.
Cool.
Hey, cheers.
Well, that great. Cool.
But actually, it's just 14. My favorite color in the background.
Oh, you're fond of yellow?
Yes.
It's always interesting to see how these things come up in different spaces. Because it's meant to be one word digital.
You're thinking of all the different reasons why you did that.
Actually, it's kind of digital.
French.
Identity.
The PowerPoint is actually doing the presentation. Yeah.
Machines are running us, right? Well, if that's your underlying point, it's they
Exactly. Yeah.
That would be done.
I'm sure. Trains also run on the opposite side
You hear that side of the thing go. Some of that's great.
You don't just carry the shoes.
Hello. Thank you very much for returning to this room promptly. I hope you are all well and you've enjoyed everything until now. We are now live streaming, so we all need to behave much better than we have until now. It is my pleasure, however, right now to introduce Professor Tania Lewis from Melbourne. She's coming. I don't think I need to specially introduce her. I'm quite sure a lot of you already know her. She is an expert in many areas, such as media and cultural studies, generally, and then green citizenship. She's written about ethical consumption and lifestyle politics, and also global media formats and multiple media modernities, with a particular focus on Southeast Asia. She's written many books, articles, and edited many collections, and also written articles with others. I would, however, prefer if she introduces herself. She says she has a little background ready. So without further ado, welcome, Tania, at this very point. Thank you.
All turned on. Thanks so much for that introduction, Anna, and I really appreciate your inviting me to be here. And I mean, I know I was not meant to say that I'm actually living in France at the moment, but so I didn't come all the way from Melbourne, but I would have if you'd asked me. Yeah, so I'm not actually jet lagged. I'm on research leave in Paris, which is a terrible thing to do when you're a research academic, but someone has to do it. And can I apologise for the here I am meant to be high tech talking about digital food, and the L seems to have done something weird on my slide, and we were just joking about PowerPoint, taking over our lives, etc. In this case, my PowerPoint, I think, has decided how to present my talk today. But actually, I quite like that, the digital food. So yes, I'm talking about a very kind of broad topic today, digital food. It's actually the title of a book that I'm working on. Really, I'm in the very early stages of that book. I've written, what did I tell my editor? A couple of chapters. It's due next year. So again, when Anna asked me to speak, I thought, what a great opportunity. I mean, the best conference I could talk at in terms of getting feedback from experts in both food and the media kind of area. As this is really a book that I'm not a food studies person. I come from a media studies background. So this is a book that's really looking at everyday digital food practices from the kind of point of view of how's the digital impacting on our lives, how is food impacting on the digital. So it's very much a kind of dialogue, I guess, between everyday digital practices and the kind of food space. And I think it's a dialogue that hopefully sheds broader light on the kind of impact of the digital on our everyday lives. Essentially, just a small kind of topic. And I guess the first thing to note, when I started doing work in the area, I was actually, I mean, everyone always says this. I was really surprised that there wasn't that much literature out there. But I have to say, in this case, there really wasn't that much literature out there. And today, actually, I've been to some fantastic papers in this area, and I think there is some great work now emerging. But certainly, when I started researching in this space, there were really only a few people doing work in the field, and not many people doing the kind of big, broad brushstroke research. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. But of course, you'll be familiar with some of the scholars that I have up here. So Signe Rousseau, who wrote one of the early books on Twitter and food. Isabelle de Solier, who's a colleague of mine in Melbourne, who's done work on the food blogging community. And then I was really lucky to be part of this digital food activism collection that's recently come out. And there's some really terrific contributions in that collection. So I highly recommend it. But as I was saying, we're kind of yet to see the sort of broad-ranging critique emerging in this space. And I think one of the reasons why is that the phenomenon of digital food is just so kind of insidious, and it's so kind of creeping and under the radar that I think for many of us, it's not till we actually start, ourselves trying to pinpoint what do we mean by digital food, that we realize just how ubiquitous it's become in our daily lives. So over the past decade, the world of food has really been quietly colonized by the digital, by online platforms and practices in all sorts of shapes and forms. So everything from obviously the world of takeaway food, the most kind of perhaps banal kind of space, has been digitized, as we all know. In fact, there was a strike, an Uber Eats delivery strike when I was in Paris, which is kind of interesting in terms of the kind of precarious labour going on in that space, but that's another story. Everything into the kind of food hub and food politics space, and more recently, the kind of farming areas. So I've really noticed that in policy and corporate documents, we're seeing smart farming, digital agriculture starting to come on the scene. And meanwhile, in the digital realm, as I was saying, we're seeing the digital realm basically being invaded by all things food related. And I think a nice kind of illustration of that is when Time magazine named the top 10 things that had broken the internet, and along with Kim Kardashian's butt, they also showcased this. Basically, it was a Kickstarter for potato salad. I don't know if people remember this. This quite ordinary guy in the US who said he was just raising money for a snack, and then he ended up with huge amount of money, and he made the largest potato salad ever, and then did all of this kind of stuff around social enterprise, raising money for food charities, etc. And I mean, it's a really nice example of both the kind of, I guess, banality in some ways of the digital food space, but also the ways in which digital food is creeping into areas like social enterprise, the sharing economy, and the growing role of kind of ordinary people in this space. So it's not just celebrity chefs, it's increasingly, your next door neighbor who suddenly appears on YouTube. So I think, this speaks to, in a sense, one of the reasons, again, why academia perhaps hasn't kind of stepped into this space so much. And one of the other areas we've been doing research on in the Digital Ethnography Research Centre is really looking at the kind of insidious ways in which everyday household rhythms and habits have started to, really being shaped by digital practices in all kinds of ways. And here's a couple from a study we've been doing. It's a 3-year longitudinal study of households in 2 states of Australia, and looking at really quite a range of socioeconomic households, spending time with those households and not looking actually at digital practices per se, but looking at people's daily household practices, and then looking at the ways in which digital media are becoming integrated into those spaces. And one of the things we were really struck by is the way that people on the one hand would often say, look, we're not really that digitally savvy, we don't do much digital stuff in our lives. And then as we spent time with them and we would take videos and get them to reenact certain household practices, they then say, oh, actually, we do a lot of digital things in our daily lives, and including making our own YouTube videos and uploading them, but not necessarily thinking of ourselves as digitally savvy. So I think there's some, interesting things going on there around the normalization of digital practices. And one of the things that we've noticed is the way in which the kitchen is starting to be colonized by digital devices. And again, often quite unnoticed until we sort of specifically talk to people about their kind of cooking practices. And here we've got a couple of images from two of the households. So the top one, this was a retired professional lady who's one of the more kind of digitally savvy people in our study, actually. And she got a wrought iron laptop holder made for her laptop because she uses it so much in the kitchen, and often to actually use YouTube videos to kind of look at specific cooking techniques. She's a really keen cook. And the chap down the bottom, who's a kind of 30-something social worker, was talking to me he was very proud of the fact that he transformed his blender base into a laptop base. And as he said, I don't use the blender anymore. It's very old school. And he uses his laptop a lot in the kitchen. So some interesting kind of old new media technology practices going on there. So I think this is a really good example of the kind of ordinaryization, in a sense, of digital food in people's lives, to the point where people really aren't necessarily aware of those practices until we kind of really pointed them out to them. And on the other hand, food and the digital, I think, have become very politicized spaces as well. So what I want to talk about today is essentially quite a broad range of practices. So I guess I'm going to give a kind of cook's tour, so to speak, of the realm of the digital food. So everything from the banal to the everyday, from the political potentials and the limitations of culinary connectivity. So in doing so, I want to talk about the way, and I've talked about this earlier, in which the digital has shaped the contemporary food space. But I'm also really interested in the way that online food is providing us, or can provide us, with some really interesting insights into the everyday engagements that we have in the digital realm. So my interest in this space has emerged out of two kind of strains of research that I've been working on over the past 2 years, few years, should I say. So the first area is really looking quite broadly at the rise of lifestyle media, lifestyle advice, particularly lifestyle advice television over the last decade around the world, and looking at using a kind of sociological frame, I guess, to look at the ways in which these shows speak to broader kinds of shifts around late modern identity, and particularly kind of the rise of, I guess, certain kinds of hegemonic middle class taste cultures, the rise of reflexive individualization, etc. But in the food space, I've been particularly looking at the kind of emergence of the sort of high-end glossy cookery shows that we saw coming out in the late 90s. So building on the work of people like Joanne Hollows, for instance, on Jamie Oliver, who was really looking at the kind of male streaming of cookery shows. And I look quite broadly at the kind of, I guess, revaluing of once feminized forms of household and everyday advice, and the kind of reframing of that advice as lifestyle. And not surprisingly, as I've been working in that space, I've increasingly found myself moving into the digital realm, where much of this is now going on. And I think also because people's engagement with food, as I've suggested, particularly in that Australian context that we've been looking at, has been shifting from television celebrity chefs to a much more kind of polymedia approach, to use that Miller and Biannual term. So really very much tied to people's everyday practices in intimate ways. And the other area, which probably seems a little bit of a contrast, but they are connected, that I've been working on is in the space of kind of ethical consumption, looking particularly at grassroots food movements in urban and suburban sites. And the pictures here are of backyard permaculture in Melbourne, and particularly Melbourne Permablitz, who are essentially a completely online movement of strangers who come together to make over suburban gardens together around Melbourne, according to permaculture principles. So they're a good kind of example of the way in which food groups and individuals are increasingly using digital technology to organise, to share information, and just generally to connect. So I want to basically structure the talk. The first half is essentially looking at lifestyle consumption and aesthetics. So first up, I'm going to talk a bit about food photography on social media. I'm then going to talk a bit about the growing role of ordinary people as key participants in online food culture. And in the second section, I'm broadly going to focus on food politics and food activism. So firstly, talking about the affordances and the constraints of digital connectivity for food politics, and then moving on to talking about the role of big food players in social media. Okay. So turning to the lifestyling of food online. Now, I think that pornography is essentially, you know, the kind of number one content provider on the internet today, but probably not far behind is food porn. If we look at this, there's some ridiculous statistics I could throw at you, but the number of food images now on social media is just extraordinary. And I think we've all seen this on our own Facebook sites, the kind of plethora of images of people going out to restaurants, sharing kind of high-end pictures of their food, and increasingly, I think, pictures of their own home cooking, and often quite intimate images of their everyday domestic lives. And we've also seen the growth of people essentially documenting their diets, their everyday diets. So diet blogging and diet apps have become huge. And this is actually the blog of a chap, a neuroscientist, Javier Garcia, who's uploaded thousands of pictures of all the food he's ever eaten. So they're quite unexciting images, but and apparently he lost his phone at one point, and he was so incredibly distraught that friends had to come over and take pictures of the food he was eating, because he felt like, you know, it's kind of a bit of, you know, you Instagram, therefore you are. I think he was very much lost without documenting everything he was eating. So I think the interesting thing there is when the digital camera first came in, we were all told that was going to be the end of photography. But I think what we're seeing is the complete opposite. That photography is just, you know, incredibly ubiquitous now, and images, amateur images shared through the internet are the, you know, dominant content online today. So I just want to take us into the Instagram space, which is, I guess, the other end of the spectrum from the kind of anti-aesthetic of the food diary. And with the growing use of Instagram, we're really seeing both an intensification of traffic around amateur food imagery, but also highly aestheticized, curated food imagery. And, you know, as those revolving images from the Guardian's winners of Best Instagram Photo indicate, I mean, incredibly professional kind of looking images. Our followers on Instagram are often people we don't know, so they're linked to taste groups or communities of practice rather than the kind of actual social ties, weak or otherwise, that we might have with our Facebook community. So, you know, I guess that a key way in which we commonly might understand the circulation of food imagery then is as an extension of a certain kind of performative selfie culture, with the performance of good taste and culinary or cultural capital being central to this. So it's perhaps not surprising that one of the key places where users are often talked about as food influencers is on Instagram. And another speaker was talking about this today, and particularly the fact that Jamie Oliver is by far the top kind of influencer on Instagram. So he's kind of seemingly very easily made this shift from being a kind of cultural intermediary in the TV space to a sort of Insta guru, although I'm sure he has a team of people who do much of his labour for him. As I noticed above, a key strand of my work since the mid-2000s has been on food and media, and particularly the role of celebrity chefs as cultural intermediaries in disseminating certain kinds of taste and dispositions in relation to food. And more recently, I've been working with colleagues in Southeast Asia, where food media has taken off in a huge way in recent years, in part due to the deregulation of the media industry, to the rise of capitalism, but also to the expansion of middle-class kind of consumers. So this screenshot is basically the food programming section of Youku, which has been referred to as China's YouTube, which is a little bit misleading because it's much more professionalized and monetized than YouTube, and it's just one of many video sharing platforms in China. And my analysis of food and media to date in the kind of global context has tended to focus on the sort of globalization of certain kinds of middle-class forms of lifestyle culture and associated modes of consumerism. But I've also been looking at shifts around gender and as I mentioned, the kind of male streaming of food media in particular, the rise of food masculinities. And I think we can see here just from a few of the shows there that there's various forms of kind of culinary masculinity played out in some of the main programs showcased on YouTube. So the internet and in particular various forms of social media in certain ways are an extension, I think, of lifestyle culture and lifestyle media, with foodie-oriented social media forms such as Instagram representing the ultimate customized, personalized form of lifestyle media. Having said that, Daniel Miller, in his recent large team global project, Why We Post, he actually came out and gave a lecture with some of his colleagues on this really terrific project. Huge project. They did ethnographies around the world and really came up with some very kind of interesting data, and I think material that challenges perhaps some of the kind of notions, I guess, bandied about around, particularly about, you know, selfie culture, the narcissism of social media, etc. And they kind of argue, contrary to the sort of social media posting as narcissism argument, that much of the reasons why we post is not about the self, but it's about our relationships with others. So their kind of argument is that, you know, the images of baked birthday cakes, lovingly prepared evening meals that we see on our daily news updates in social media perform relations of care and love towards others as much as they perform self-identity. Now, similarly, in an essay entitled The Conversational Image, Andre Guntier argues that in the social media realm, photography uses have become tied to a social or communicative logic. So he essentially argues that they're losing their symbolic representational function and are becoming kind of integrated into an economy of communicative exchange. And as he puts it, conversation online is no longer about photos, but with photos. So in this context, I guess questions of taste and aesthetics become less relevant than understanding images in terms of their purely phatic or conversational role. So this is a kind of post-symbolic, post-representational argument. And here he suggests that Snapchat is kind of exemplary of this kind of new communicative moment where images are purely sent for conversational purposes and they're ephemeral. They capture a moment or a mood and then they disappear. So a key theme of much media and cultural studies work on digital engagement, and particularly in social media, has been on the forms of online sociality, particularly cultures of sharing and participation that have blossomed on internet platforms such as YouTube. Now, arguably, sites like YouTube marked really quite a radical shift from earlier consumption-based digital media engagements tied to downloading. They really did enable us to move into a much more kind of upload-oriented culture of creativity and prosumerism. And of course, this was very much enabled by the affordances of Web 2.0. And as Jose van Dyke put it in her really insightful book, The Culture of Connectivity, it's a terrific book on the kind of recent history of social media. This really amounts to nothing less than new forms of kind of sociality or social relations online. And in their very well-known book on YouTube, which they've now got a new version of, I haven't managed to get hold of it yet, but Jean Burgess and Josh Green argue that digital media engagement is no longer about consumers and producers, professionals and amateurs, or even commercial and non-commercial players, but really has to be understood in terms of a kind of continuum of cultural participation. And in my work on food and media, I've been similarly interested in the rise of what I term ordinary experts, so the growing role of ordinary people providing advice and demonstrating expertise in food and cooking, for instance, and the increasingly blurred line between celebrity chefs and amateur cooks. A shift that, of course, first took place on reality television, but whose logic is very much moved to digital platforms. And such displays of ordinary expertise around food are perhaps most evident on YouTube, I think, where food videos and food channels constitute a substantial proportion of the content, and where there's a huge amount of amateur content, if we can call it that. It's becoming, I think, increasingly complicated. And I've just got some UK-related stats from Ofcom up here on YouTube use, which I think are interesting in terms of particularly looking at the growing numbers of people who are uploading their own videos, whether it's them cooking, emulating a cooking show, or actually live streaming their eating. I was talking to someone earlier about the mukbang phenomenon in Korea, which has really, become globally huge, actually. With people in the US, it's really taken off as well. People basically just live streaming their meal, they're eating. They've got an audience, a social media audience who they have a little bit of a chat with. And that genre has evolved in all sorts of ways. And I think it also speaks to the kind of sheer incredible diversity of what's going on in video sharing spaces like YouTube. Now, according to Google, who of course now own YouTube, cooking and food is the fastest growing genre on the video sharing service. And as I noted with the Australian study, we were actually really surprised. We hadn't expected this finding of people increasingly using YouTube, for instance, in their food engagements. And I think the interesting thing here is a kind of return to earlier modes of cooking advice in certain kinds of ways. So if reality TV has increasingly moved away from, this is again something we were talking about in an earlier session, it's moved away from, I guess, old school educational cooking shows. The focus is much more on spectacle, on kitchen stadiums, etc., and on competition. Then YouTube takes us back in many ways to the kind of the old style, I guess, of how-to cookery. And I think what's interesting, not in all cases, because I think there's certain kinds of amateur video where you're still seeing a kind of an attempt to offer kind of a professional, glossy kind of image of the household. But many amateur videos, instead of the kind of pseudo-domestic household setting of, say, daytime TV, you're really seeing a classic ordinary kitchen where someone's cooking, often, with pets leaving around the place and children interrupting, etc. And we're seeing actual householders also labouring over food, and there'll often be, some of these videos can be quite dull because they have long periods of labour. It's not necessarily the here's one I prepared earlier approach to cooking. Okay, so I'm just going to show a completely random video clip at this point. It's actually, I'm actually going to do a chapter in the book on food masculinities, because initially I hadn't included this in the book at all. But as I was encountering material, particularly on YouTube, I was just blown away by how much material there is men basically cooking in all sorts of shapes and forms, but the kind of connections going back to figures like Jamie Oliver were also what really kind of struck me. So I just want to show you a very brief clip from Vice TV, which is actually surprisingly on YouTube. It's Matty Mattison. I don't know if you know this chap. He's been described as, basically he swears a lot, and he's sort of the bad boy of Canadian cookery shows. And he's described as dropping the F-bomb more than Jamie Oliver drops Pakataka or something. You know, this is often his kind of claim to fame, but he actually is a really good cook as well. So I'll just show you a little.
Perfect little pancake, isn't it? It is. Yes, it is, Matty. Yes, it is. We got some cakes here, boys. Made with love. I'm Matty Matheson, and these are fucking pancakes. I flipped these guys once. They're pretty good. I'm going to take them off. Got a short stack. This is called a short stack. The best pancakes in the world are right here on this plate. And now we're going to take some of Montreal's best maple syrup. So this is the OG pancake here. Then we're going to make some blueberry pancakes next. Okay? I hate when people make like blueberry pancakes and put like 3 fucking blueberries in it. Let's just make a lot of blueberries in it. Fucking load it up. You know? What's up? This is a blueberry pancake. This is the best one you've ever had. I just showed you how to do it. Don't fuck it up. Don't tweet me about your ugly ass pancakes. These are beautiful. I only want to see beautiful pancakes coming from you guys. You can.
Matty Death Bro is I love that. So I'm doing I'm focusing on a few different culinary bros. There's some really interesting stuff going on online at the moment. Okay, so back to YouTube. I mean, I think the interesting thing about YouTube is that while on the one hand we're seeing some really crazy kind of niche material coming out in that space, it's also, of course, becoming increasingly monetized and professionalized. And I think an interesting example of that is Sorted Food, who are a UK group who initially, well, this is the story they tell. They say that initially they met in a pub. They were a bunch of dietarily challenged men. And then they decided to make food videos to show their other male friends how to cook. And that out of that, they became one of YouTube's big money makers in the kind of global food space. And they're an interesting group. I mean, they actually very much eschew that they don't like to talk about themselves as a business at all. They talk about connecting friends rather than customers, and describe themselves as a global movement rather than a business. But I think they're a good example of kind of creeping monetization of online relationships and friendship networks. And Van Dyke's work, I think, is really useful here for thinking about the ways in which connectivity and participation have been converted into forms of economic exchange. And she talks a lot about algorithmic culture and the ways in which that's played out through platforms like YouTube. So in concrete terms, we're seeing increasingly the kind of professionalization of content on YouTube, and at least content that's seen as monetizable. So my colleague Ramon Lobato in the Digital Ethnography Research Centre has been doing some work around this, interviewing people involved, some of the intermediaries involved with kind of monetizing content in this space. And he makes the argument that while YouTube kind of started life as a sort of new kid on the block with the sort of promise of DIY communication, that a decade down the track, and since it's been bought out by Google, it's become this very complicated system of managing content and often monetizing content. And he focuses particularly on professional multi-channel networks such as Tastemade. And I don't know if you've come across Tastemade. They're an interesting group who they basically search globally for talent, for amateur talent, who they then train up, and they convert their shows into professional, very high-end, glossy kinds of content, essentially. All part of what Ramon argues is a kind of a drive by Google to make YouTube look more like television. So in the second part of the talk, I want to kind of extend upon this kind of critique and talk about a little bit about the affordances of digital connectivity, but also the constraints it offers in terms of food politics. Now, one kind of key development here is the argument made by social media theorists that we're essentially seeing kind of the emergence of a new political realm, a new potential generation of citizens, variously described as digital citizens and cyber protesters. And in the food space, the apparent benefits of the kind of culture of participation highlighted by Burgess and Green is that we are seeing a range of actors aiming to challenge global agribusiness. So we're seeing, I guess, figures who we wouldn't normally see pop up in the political space. So everything from farmers to restaurateurs to consumers who've been able to use digital platforms to politically connect and to become visible around food issues. Now, I think one of the more contentious areas in the alternative food movement in relation to claims to new digital food citizenship is the role of app-driven engagement or activism. Olio, I think, is a good example of some of the kinds of more privatized approaches to politics that have emerged. So this is an app that potentially connects neighbours with each other and with local businesses to exchange their edible surplus food. And I think you can see by the sort of byline that they use that there's a sort of emphasis here on a kind of civic consumerism. That consumption is framed here as a kind of potentially collective political transformative act. At the same time, there's obvious limits to this kind of privatised, consumer-driven approach to foodscapes, and potentially one could argue that some practices deflect from rather than contribute to changing the reality of global agribusiness. So what might be the more structural benefits of the digital turn and Web 2.0 in particular for the alternative food movement? Now, it's still a nascent area of research, as I'm sure you all know, but there's growing work out there suggesting that particularly for alternative food networks, that there are key kind of affordances in the digital space. There's some of my colleagues at QUT, Queensland University of Technology, have been working in Australia looking at the impact of the digital on shaping alternative urban food systems. And they make this kind of argument that rather than disconnecting us from alternative food networks, that paradoxically we could argue that social media can actually reconnect us to the materialities of food production. And I guess a kind of concrete example of that would be the Open Food Network, which was set up in 2012 in Australia. And it was actually based on US software created by players like Local Dirt. And as you can see from the diagram, the network aims to literally link local food buyers to local food sellers. And the Open Food Network has since expanded its offering around the world through sharing open source software. And there's actually a UK Open Food Network now. And as we know, the rise of local and regional food hubs has very much been hampered by key problems of scale. The question of how do you join up these efforts, how do you rescale them in cheap and efficient ways while still adhering to social and environmental rather than commercial drivers has been a key kind of problem. So here the connective affordances of web platforms have crucially enabled distributed local systems to link up. And particularly, I think, to link a range of players from community groups to farmers. Now, beyond connecting food hubs and producers, environmental scholars have also researched the benefits of social media for digital protest and activism. And there's a really terrific PhD that Ginevra Adamoli has done on the role of impact of Facebook on the food movement in the US, and she provides a really interesting case study of the Right to Know rally that happened in 2011, and shows that actually sometime about 18 months before that occurred physically on the streets in US cities, that social media users were building a long campaign online, primarily through Facebook. And I mean, the interesting thing was she focuses on how those groups were often quite wary of Facebook and very reflexive about how they were using it in terms of data privacy, etc. But nevertheless, the platform had huge benefits in terms of bringing together a range of diverse actors and networks to organise collectively. So in a sense, I guess there's a challenge there to the kind of collectivism kind of argument that, this is just sort of armchair politics. As she suggests, that all of that organisation then led to ordinary citizens protesting in the streets of their local communities. And of course, there was some shift in the laws around GMO food labelling after that protest. And I think Zizi Papacharithi's kind of argument here is a nice way of understanding where Facebook politics, I guess, might sit in terms of a kind of thinking about the sort of problematics of digital food politics. And as she suggests that these are not exactly kind of public spaces; they're kind of quasi-civic spaces, problematic spaces. But they do enable the possibility, particularly for very scattered and distributed groups, to articulate a kind of sizable opposition in response to concentrated ownership and regulation. Okay, well, I'm realising that we're running out of time a bit, so I'm going to skip a bit just to talk about Monsanto briefly, one of our favourite corporations, who I think are also a really nice example of the kind of complexity of questions of visibility and transparency in online space. In recent years, Monsanto have really been pushing hard to give themselves a kind of social media edge. They've really framed or attempted to reframe public debate around biotech in terms of what they call the conversation around modern farming and food production. And you've got these sort of fake people asking questions of Monsanto. Why is there such a huge campaign against Monsanto? And as a way for them to then produce these kind of very pet, standardized kind of answers. And I think the interesting thing here is this sort of attempt to rebrand via social media using discourses like sustainable development, biological conservation, etc. But they've also been really kind of pushing for their executives essentially to get out there and show the friendly kind of face of Monsanto through, as you see, a bit of selfie snapping there by one of their execs, who was interviewed by Wired and didn't ask their permission to take this picture, but this kind of trying to get in with the kids and show the kind of face of Monsanto next to these other kinds of brands. And the interesting thing is they've recently hired a director of millennial engagement, and they've funded a food fellowship for journalists. So they're really trying to kind of get into the social media space in a big way. So having done research on them, and then the recent kind of win that Dwayne Johnson had, just becomes quite an incredible accomplishment, I think, because actually, as they showed in that court case, Monsanto have been putting huge amounts of money behind the scenes into essentially preventing protest and debate around, particularly, obviously, Roundup and the dangers of glyphosate. So I'm sure people have followed some of the debate here. The court documents showed, for instance, that they had a program that Monsanto had created called Let Nothing Go, which basically found debates across social media, anything to do with Roundup, and then would try and extract the text from online space, etc., to the point where protesters were deliberately misspelling Monsanto to try and get around the trolls, etc. So I think a really interesting kind of example, I think, of both the kind of visible, transparent aspects of online engagement, and then what's going on behind the scenes. So I think I just want to very quickly sum up. Obviously, I'm talking about a space that's extremely diverse, and it's very hard to make kind of generalizations, universalizations about this space. But I think some of the kind of recurrent concerns lie around this question of the sort of antinomies of visibility, transparency, and connectivity. We see positive affordances in terms of collectivism and scale for alternative food movements with visibility and connectivity. But on the other hand, there's this concern that the digital sphere is increasingly being colonized by capital. And I think something else that I haven't had a chance to speak to, but the question of big data, who's managing data, what's done with it. Clearly, there are potentials for the alternative food movement in the data space, and also for farming, for sustainable farming around soil management, etc. But I think on the other side, there are real concerns about the kind of fetishization of data systems that could occur in the digital food space. And I've been reading some of the documents coming out of Australian kind of policy, government policy in this space, and it evidences a growing disconnect with food systems, if anything. And I think finally, the thing that I probably want to end on is this kind of, and it really comes full circle to the study that we've been doing with households. This kind of really, this colonization of the home by digital technologies and the thoroughly embedded nature of everyday digital use, I think calls for a certain kind of digital literacy. And the Crokers have argued that, we need to know our code, but I think it kind of goes beyond that. It also speaks to the fact that we need to understand the kind of material practices, such as, the kind of infrastructure and the smart technologies that are increasingly coming into the home. And here we've got an image of the new fridge, the smart fridge, as the kind of new family hub. Interesting shift from the sort of TV as the family hub to the fridge. It doesn't sound quite as warm as and inviting, but it's this argument that the smart fridge will basically run your home, do your washing for you, etc. So, okay, so I might just end on. Now, this is actually the latest. I don't think anyone breaks the internet anymore. I think now we have virals, we have memes, we've got GIFs, etc. And this is apparently the latest kind of food GIF. Do people know Salt Bay? So Salt Bay, classic example of an ordinary guy. He's a Turkish butcher who basically shot a video of himself doing that, and he's now become massive. He's So, and this is the new kind of, you can see GIFs of this everywhere with various people doing their own little versions of it. So maybe that can be our theme for the conference. So thank you.
I can't believe you have no questions.
Or comments.
Because I wanted to ask about this pancakes.
Oh, the pancakes. Don't ask me for the recipe.
Yeah, actually, I was wondering because, there's a very similar channel in Poland where there's also a man who cooks, and he also uses a lot of bad language, swears a lot. And I was wondering, is it like some kind of connection? Because when you think about the domestic cooking, it's a very feminine, traditionally feminine sphere. So, do you think it's a way to maintain their masculinity by using this language, or did you see some other ways of like
Yeah,
trying to make it not so serious. Like they are like showing that you're not serious about it, you're making fun, so you're still deadly. We're still okay.
Yeah, we're still okay. That's what we're bros. So yeah. Yeah, look, I think absolutely. I mean, it's and in certain ways, if we look back to the early Jamie Oliver, where he was, getting around on his Vespa, and he was much cooler back then. He wasn't so much doing bad dad jokes on television. And I mean, that was that attempt to kind of make cookery shows cool. And I mean, back in the early 2000s, I remember talking to TV producers in Australia and saying, "Oh, did you know in Britain TV shows and now primetime TV is cooking shows?" And they were going, "Oh, well, that'll never work in Australia." And it's like not that long after MasterChef became the most popular show ever in Australian history, and it's dominated by men. So TV producers in Australia really just saw cookery as purely feminized television, as daytime TV, as of having no interest whatsoever to a broader audience. So I think figures like Jamie Oliver very cleverly enabled some of that transition to occur. And so I'd see that I think there's a genealogy there that links him to these new guys. They're kind of new lads, the new lads of online cookery. And I mean, I would love to just do a talk on that topic because there's just some great material out there. Lots of guys trying to be very street, and it's really a very interesting kind of space. And there's also quite a lot of food and violence is another area I think that's really interesting. So there was a video I thought about showing you, but my husband actually thought it was too offensive. So I thought, well, if he thinks it's offensive, then yeah. And really, what is about it? It's a challenge to kind of food and well-being. It's a how to make a smoothie, but it involves lots of carnage, basically, generally. So yeah.
So thank you very much for the presentation. Interesting. You were mentioning in an answer before that claims that increasing photo sharing in relation to food was changing our relationship to food in our everyday practices. Based on your empirical research.
Yeah, increasing what? Sorry, what that?
Our relationship to food.
Yes, yeah.
So based on the research that you have conducted in the household, what would you say that are the main changes that technology has made in our relationship with food?
That's a huge question, and I think that's in part what the book needs to be exploring. And I hope you can help me explore with that paper that you presented. Sending a version of that to me would be great. Yeah, look, and I'm not wanting to sound determinist either with this. I think we're seeing a lot of complex shifts, obviously, around the sharing economy, for instance, and social enterprise, etc. And the digital and food are part of a whole range of broader socioeconomic shifts there that we can't reduce them to one or the other. So I think as a sociologist of media, I'm looking at the big picture here, and I'd see much of this as contextual, as co-articulated, rather than digital doing this to food. I think we're seeing lots of shifts occurring in the foodscape, and the digital is part of that. I mean, I guess one example would be someone was talking about convenience culture. I think it's Lebesco and Plato were in their paper. I think the digital has articulated to food and convenience culture in interesting kinds of ways, but it certainly hasn't created it. It's reshaping it in key kinds of ways, and obviously Uber Eats, delivery, which is massive now in Melbourne, and I presume everyone in the room is nodding that it's massive here in Edinburgh. No, interesting. Okay, yeah, you don't have it. I think there's a really great cross-cultural research to be done on that area, because Melbourne, it claims to be a huge foodie city, and yet there's been this massive rise in kind of high-end takeout food. So there's some interesting kind of paradoxes, I think, around that. But I don't know that I'm in a position yet to answer your question. It's a good one.
Question at the back and then here. And anybody else then?
Sorry, 10.
Then start. going forward. Okay, and then we will have to stop, unfortunately, after this.
I'm interested in hearing you elaborate on food and finance.
Food and finance. What did you say?
Violence.
Violence. Oh, food and violence. I was thinking, oh my God, not food and finance, because I know nothing about food and finance. Food and violence.
You just mentioned it.
Yes, I know. I mean, in some ways, it's a throwaway comment because I've just, been encountering a few of these violent food videos, basically, in not just in YouTube, but in some other video sharing platforms that I was looking at. So I don't know what to make of that. I think that in part it's speaking to some of these questions around masculinity in the food space and this kind of reclaiming of domestic space, what occurs in domestic space, whether that's just about new forms of domestic masculinity. I don't know that I can make that statement at this point.
Violence, what kind of violence?
Well, for instance, the blender smoothie example is a very popular video on YouTube where you watch the beginning of it and it looks like a well-being kind of oriented YouTube video complete with kind of yoga, soft music. And I think it's a blueberry smoothie they're meant to be making. You see the blender, it's making the smoothie. And then suddenly the blender explodes and dead chickens start dancing around the room, and then they start getting pulled apart. There's blood everywhere, and it sort of seems to move into some kind of genre of horror, but it's extremely violent, and it seems like a kind of subversion of the feminized, well-being, controlled world of eating and kind of, it's an interesting video. It's actually quite disturbing. But I guess, I'm just wondering if it's speaking to some of the things that you were pointing to.
Can I just say, if you would like to take a 6:13 train, you need to leave from here in 5 minutes.
Oh, okay.
How many of you would like to do that?
Should we continue the discussion over dinner?
So maybe, if you don't mind, we can stop here and continue the discussion.
Sounds good.
Can I make a suggestion? Are you going to title your chapter on food masculinities the digital lads?
Digital lads, yeah, new ladism.
The lads of online food.
Yeah, that would be good, isn't it?
If you miss this trend, there's another one 5 to sell. Okay.
All right, okay. I think I might miss it.
Are you not coming for dinner?
No. Will you be at the dinner?
Okay, well, then
Yeah.
Oh, excellent.
Well, then I'll save my question.
Okay, great. You going?
Yes, I will be at dinner, and I did my PhD from Macquarie University.
Oh, did you?
Yes, so I
Okay.
just thought,
Cool.
one knows a connection to another.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed this talk actually because so my research has been on how the media frames sustainable food practices.
Oh, good. Okay. Oh, I'd love to read some of that.
Yes, that was my PhD in Australia, and I was looking, of course, at mainstream media.
Right. Yeah.
And I've been looking at some of your work. I looked at, and I see you've done a lot of more interesting work on India as well.
Yeah.
And I'm originally from India.
Oh, okay. Right.
So,
okay. Yeah.
So it's just very interesting. I see a lot of intersections on the sustainability issues and on things. My focus is on climate change.
Right.
So climate-friendly food practices, plant-based organic, so non-GMOs is part of my
Okay. Right.
local food.
So he will show.
Oh, interesting. We've got some. It's quite a few people actually at my university doing work in this broad space. So veganism, non-meat alternatives, etc. as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd love to do work in India actually. Around
Yes, I did a little pilot on India and
Oh,
how
did you?
Indian media. I've not published it because it's just a 3-month pilot, and I think I should just maybe publish it somewhere where they would accept it. I don't know where, because there is no other work in India on how Indian media represent climate-friendly food, and if there is any representation.
Yeah, that would be.
Yes, so well, I find it a food security issue, not really. Yes, it's interesting. I would love to talk about it and share it.
Yeah.
Are you by car?
No, I'm
So
not.
we better go.
What do you
better
guys?
go because I don't want you to be late or something.
Okay.
I'm going by car, so I can switch this off. Do you know where to go?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So
no,
you go.
actually,
You
no,
go
I
out
know
of
where
the
the
university.
station
You
is, I
turn
know
to
where
the right,
Yep.
and you walk, and you will see a bridge there and the train.
Okay.
Station. Yeah.
Okay. Brilliant.
And you
Okay,
then
I'll just
get
leave
off, and there you use some sort of technology to make you.
Yes, I
come
have
to-
technology to figure
Some
out.
kind of technology.
Yes.
Perfect. I'll see you there.
Is there a dustbin?
Sorry, I hope I didn't run through
Uh,
time.
Oh no, that's fine. It's just there is